On this episode of Behind the Brand, I'll be speaking with Faye Pang, country manager at Xero. Xero is on a mission to become the most trusted and insightful small business platform in the world. At the time of this recording, Xero has a market cap of over $20 billion. Prior to Xero, Faye was the general manager for Uber Eats Canada, where her and I were actually rivals, competing in the food delivery space. In this episode, we cover a lot of topics, from how Xero chooses talent, to how Canadian SMEs are struggling, and how open banking can revolutionize the way that Canadian businesses do their accounting. I want to start out with your experience with Uber, because this is where, even though we never really met each other, I feel like we kind of did meet each other through competing against one another while you were at Uber and I was at Skip the Dishes. Tell me a bit about your experience with Uber Eats, because you guys launched Canada.
That's
right.
You
launched Uber Eats globally.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff. Yeah, it's really nice to be spending some time with my former mortal enemy. And so, I was on the original team that launched the Uber Eats app back in 2015. And this is a little known fact, but Toronto was actually the global test city for that app. So Uber Eats had existed in some shape or form before that, really living within the Uber Rides app. And then in 2015, the decision was made, we're going to launch the first standalone app in Uber history. And for various reasons, competitive, like media market, et cetera, the Toronto was chosen to be that first city. So at the time, there were 6 of us on the ops team. You know, they dropped in engineers and product folks from San Francisco into our Toronto boardroom for a couple of weeks. And December 9th, 2015, we launched in Toronto with 80 restaurants on day one. So it was a trip, so much fun. And I distinctly remember thinking about how we're going to compete against Skip the Dishes and where you all had, stronghold markets and how well you were doing at the time, and just really being like a really good push for us from a competitive standpoint to say, we've got to deliver better value and do it faster and leverage our unique advantages at Uber to try and make a dent. So fun times.
Well, I remember, you guys launched in Toronto, and I remember being like, well, that's not good. I mean, we hadn't even raised any VC money at all. Yeah. So it was literally me and a few friends maxing out our credit cards at that point. In fact, we still were ordering, like we would occasionally order from restaurants that wouldn't get orders, like on our own credit card, just to kind of like fake it till you make it. And then you guys launched. Just Eat had launched in Canada.
And then, the food delivery explosion with DoorDash coming to the market. Like it was, that was a really fun time. It was fun. Yeah, it was fun. It was also terrifying because, we were like, how the heck are we going to do this? And I remember hearing stories about Uber. They're like, some restaurants are getting like 20 to 30 orders a day from Uber. And like, we had like one restaurant maybe in Canada that was doing that type of volume. And it seemed like, and maybe it's like, it gets amplified, but you'd be like, every restaurant's getting 20 or 30, orders a day. And it's like, you guys were like the big, you were the boogeyman against us. What was it like, I guess, working for, Uber was still a startup. It's pre-IPO.
Obviously a very, very big one.
Yeah.
But this was almost a startup within a startup. And I feel like a lot of companies do this where they try to launch like a digital sub-brand, or they'll try to do something different. And it really never gains traction. Like you hardly see success stories like this. What do you think made Uber Eats successful? Like, because Uber Eats expanded globally from Toronto.
That's right. Yeah. And we often refer to ourselves as the startup within the startup of Uber, right? So at that point, ride sharing was well established. And really the thesis was, if we can have this fleet and network of cars in any city, like what else could we deliver, right? If we can deliver people from point A to point B, what else could we do? And there were so many hypotheses that we tested in that space, whether it was packages, pharmaceutical goods, et cetera. And ultimately, like food was the thing that hit. But Uber was really good at that time, and still today, of incubating ideas internally and sort of carving out the space and saying, here are the guardrails, and we're going to fund this, but we're also going to measure how well it does relative to our internal benchmarks, and make some big bets. So all credit to Travis at the time, and Jason Droege, who was the head of Uber Everything, just to say, we want to make a bet in this space. We have this hypothesis and thesis around the fact that Uber could do this well, and just testing and iterating. Like the first few iterations of Uber Eats before we launched the app, they did not make money, right? They were not scalable. It was a lunch product in the back of vehicles, driving around town. Like, do you remember? Yeah, so it was a beautiful product. I loved it. Turns out it wasn't profitable and probably would never be, right? So that was the very first iteration of Uber Eats, second, and then it continued to expand from there. So it was just a really fun environment, pre-IPO, obviously heavily focused on growth, but the environment that Uber cultivated and still has to this day was really one of innovation and just trying stuff, right?
Yeah, and it feels like a lot of this things that you said about doing a startup within a startup successfully sound like things that we already kind of know. I think the difference though is that you actually did them. Like when it comes to, I remember the cars driving around and it was like 5-minute delivery.
That's right.
But like it was just so difficult to actually have the proper utilization to make that turn. And then you guys killed it. I think within 6 months or something. I think it was killed. And whereas I think when you look at other brands that are doing things that aren't working, they can't scale, they just keep doing them and drag them out, and then they end up just, instead of iterating on the product, they just kill the whole program.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, making the decision to deprecate or kill something is one of the toughest ones you can make, right? There's a sunk cost fallacy. There's all of this emotion tied up in it. But at Uber, in those days, it was very much a test and learn, test and iterate. Even a failure is a lesson for us and something that we can take away to the next project or the next initiative.
How much do you think of Uber Eats' success, and how much influence did Travis Kalanick have at that stage in the business? And I wonder, is more credit attributed to him than it's worth, or was he legitimately that important to the success of Uber and Uber Eats at that stage?
Yeah, I would say TK, he permeated everything within the Uber culture, right? But certainly the head of Uber Everything, his name's Jason Droege, incredible leader and thought partner to TK. And so he really drove the vision for Uber Everything and Uber Eats. And what I think Travis brought to the table was just, the pace, the desire to try new things, make big bets, challenge convention. Those were the things that from a culture perspective just went all across, up, down, and sideways. But Jason Droege was really the one that empowered us as an Uber, we call them Uber Everything, but the Uber Everything team, to say, how are we actually going to launch, a totally standalone app in Toronto in 2.5 months? And then, how do we then scale that to the world? So both of them played a really, really pivotal role for sure.
So what led to your move over to Xero? What was that process like?
My move to Xero, funny enough, Xero called me when I was pregnant with my second son, and thinking about actually going on mat leave, Jeff, if you can believe it. And they said, listen, we're scaling the business in Canada. Have you heard of the brand? I said, of course I have. Would you want to come and help run the Canadian business as a country manager? And one of the things to know about me and my history is my parents were small business owners, right? They were first generation Chinese immigrants that came to Canada and immediately set up their own small business. And they toiled away at that.
What kind of business?
It was the glamorous business of wholesale meat distribution. So they would literally take deliveries from the Maple Leafs and the Olympials of the world, and they would process it in their warehouse and then pack and prep it to restaurants and supermarket requirements. And then they would hand deliver that to Chinatown here in Toronto, Scarborough, etc. So they ran that business for 23 years, super unglamorous. But I had a first, front row seat to my mom running the books, my dad running the shop, them not having a proper accountant for many years, them not being able to have access to capital, the challenge they went through with staffing and payroll and knowing how much money they had in the bank at any given moment. And so when I learned more about what Xero did, I really thought a lot about my parents, to be honest with you, of the impact that technology like Xero and others like us can have on helping small businesses better understand their financial position, get better access to capital, and ultimately survive and thrive, right? So that was really my motivation for coming. I'd worked with small businesses in the context of Uber Eats and the restaurant business, but this was a chance for me to get into a whole different ballgame and really try to improve small business outcomes here in Canada. So I really gravitated towards that element of the opportunity. And then the other piece was just the culture. A lot to love about the Uber culture. But one of the things that really drew me to Xero was it's a really human company. In fact, that's one of the core founding values of Xero was this notion of human. Yes, we're a technology company, but we're building tech for humans and we're humans building it. And so how do you kind of approach the process and how we do business with that front of mind? So I really resonated with that through the interview process.
So help our listeners understand what does Xero bring to the table for people? Yeah.
So if you haven't heard of Xero, it's a cloud-based accounting software and small business platform, right? So we serve 3.95 million small businesses around the world today. And we really help small businesses manage their books, right? And stay on top of their financial position. So everything from bookkeeping, reconciliation, tax compliance, and ultimately we started over 17 years ago in Wellington, New Zealand, off our founder, Rod Drury's vision, which was there's got to be a way for me to better collaborate with my accountant. At the time, he was basically sending floppy disks of data in the mail to his accountant so that by the time it got to them, it was out of date. And they were going back and forth on what is the real position today? And he observed an opportunity to actually build a ledger in the cloud. Ahead of his time, this has never been a desktop product that was adopted to cloud. Xero has always been cloud first. And so the idea was we've got this great technology. We can have a real-time ledger that I can collaborate with my accountant or my advisor on. And then therefore, what's that going to unlock for me as a small business owner in terms of insights, right? In terms of timely decision-making. And then if I think about connecting in additional apps, and so Xero has 1,000 apps in our ecosystem, everything to help you from payroll to timesheet and scheduling, payments, capturing your carbon footprints, whatever you want to do as a small business, these all now plug into Xero. And so you've got that small business platform that really enables small business owners and their accountants and their bookkeepers to better collaborate and ultimately create better outcomes.
And how much of it is automation as well as collaboration?
Yeah, for sure.
Because when I think about what you're bringing to the table, and I just, I worked with a lot of SMBs, my family growing up as well. We had small businesses in our family, and so many of them get bogged down by the day-to-day kind of drudgery of doing things that just need to be done, and they don't have anyone to do them. They can't pay for someone to do it, so they end up doing it themselves. And and that's time away from doing many of the things they love, which might be spending time with their family.
Yeah.
And so when I see companies like yourself bringing technology at the table that cuts down on some of that work, saves time, automates things, I know that that's like a mother or father who gets to go home a little bit earlier that day and spend time with their kids. And you were probably one of those kids growing up. But how much is this? Is this a time-saving tool as well as a collaboration tool?
Yeah, you nailed it, Jeff. Yeah, definitely. There is so much that technology can unlock in terms of giving small business owners back time, right? And if you think about time being their most valuable resource in life, there's a pretty high threshold for small business owners to really want to do everything themselves, right? If you think about just the mentality of starting your own businesses, wanting to rely on yourself and wanting to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty. And unfortunately, what we see is that really extends for far longer than it should when it comes to managing their books and doing the stuff that you need to do to keep the lights on, whether that's payroll or, again, tax compliance, just chasing payments that you're owed and thinking about how you're going to pay the bills that you need to pay, right? That's stuff that no small business owner is like, I'm so excited to start my own business so that I can manage my accounting, right? So no one ever, right? They want to focus on their product or their service or their customers. Yeah. And so 100% Xero really adds a lot of value for those small business owners just in automating stuff and using AI and ML to actually intelligently code transactions and help take that from a multi-hour a month process to minutes, right? And really giving them that time back to focus on building their business. So 100% we see folks really adopting Xero for that purpose and again, gaining time back. And then that amplifies again when you plug in all the things that can plug into Xero. We've got some incredible payroll partners in Canada, right? Folks like WagePoint and Payment Evolution, Rise and Humi. And so we have small business customers that are actually leveraging that technology to make payroll, which today is still very manual for a lot of small businesses, like literally run out of an Excel spreadsheet. We see them actually using the latest technology to get back time, minimize errors, and create a better employee experience too.
You mentioned that Xero is a global business based out of New Zealand, and I feel like it's like one of the only global businesses I've heard based out of New Zealand, which I kind of like. Like I feel like everyone loves people from New Zealand, so that's like a really good. It's probably good for your brand. I expect. But what are you seeing in other countries? Because I feel like very few people get the experience like starting and running a company, 0 to 20 in another country, and so maybe they don't know how each country is different, and like some countries have really, really good regulatory frameworks for people to get up and running, and some don't. Some kind of favor larger companies over smaller companies. What are you seeing from that global perspective, and what can you kind of tell our listeners about what's different about Canada?
Happy to share some global insights on that front, and maybe to call back to a podcast that you did recently with Hannah Zadie from Wealthsimple. Like you both were talking about how Canadian consumers in large part are being underserved by our financial systems and the regulatory environment today. And one thing that you said, Jeff, really stuck with me is Canadians seem to be okay being okay. And I would say that I would extend that to small businesses too, because what we see is that Canadian small businesses are really doing it tough relative to their counterparts in other parts of the world. And I'll give you some data to back that statement up. So we do a very regular, always-on program called Xero Small Business Insights, XSBI for short. And this is anonymized and aggregated data across tens of thousands of small businesses in North America, tracking 3 key metrics, right? So sales growth or decline, payment time, so late payment times, and how long are they waiting to get paid, right? So key markers really laddering up to what's the cash flow position of Canadian small businesses? How crunched are they feeling? And the headline from our latest data, which is the period ending September 2023, is that Canadian small businesses continue to struggle in this way. So for 6 consecutive months, sales have been lower than a year ago, right? And they're currently waiting in Canada over a week to get paid past the deadline, right? So 8 days late on average. We call these unauthorized loans. For a small business, this could be make or break, right? We often hear the saying like, cash is king. It is especially true in the environment that we're operating in today. And so both of those things combined, that, consecutive 6-month sales decline over the year before, and then waiting on average 8 days to be paid beyond the due date that they've got on the invoice. There's some significant cash flow crunch in the system today.
They're getting pinched, it sounds like.
They're getting pinched.
On both sides.
Yeah. And you asked the question, like, how does that compare? We do XSBI across all of our major markets around the world. And so, we see better results in the UK and the US. And of all the markets, Canada has the dubious honor of the slowest sales growth over that time period, right? So that data to me, and it's real, like anonymized, aggregated, straight out of the ledger to say, we know from our data and from XSBI that Canadian small businesses are lagging behind those counterparts in the UK and the US.
So what do you think is contributing to this? The lagging sales growth, the delay in getting paid. What are the root causes?
Yeah, there's a few things, and there's been no shortage of thought pieces recently around the declining Canadian productivity across, the entire economy. But in particular, when you think about small businesses being 98% of all businesses in Canada and 53% of the GDP, there's a lot to be concerned about, right? Just the macro trends are really showing you that there's stress in that system. In terms of what's contributing to it, I think there's a few things, right? One is, you mentioned earlier, the regulatory regime, right? We don't have open banking here in Canada. In fact, we're the last OECD country to not have that. We don't have real-time rail payments modernization, right? And so those are things that we've seen in other markets, like the UK, as an example. They launched open banking over 5 years ago. It was a force multiplier for tech adoption within the small business ecosystem, and it contributed to an explosion in fintechs and ultimately competition and better choice for small businesses, right? And so they were able to use different methods to both make and collect payments, again, contributing to reducing that pinch on late payment times and just the financial burden of collecting payments, right? And so regulatory regime, we are behind in Canada, right? And there's been, even on your podcast, so much good discussion around open banking, the impact that's going to have on Canadian consumers. What we saw in the UK is it had a outsized impact on small businesses, right? So we don't talk about that enough. Open banking is going to be so meaningful for the average Canadian consumer. It's going to be a game changer for small businesses because it's just going to unlock all of this additional benefit and time back when you think about tapping into the technology. And the example I'll share with you, Jeff, is today, right? Credential sharing and screen scraping is the most common way for a small business to get their bank data into Xero. And that is a fundamentally flawed. Yeah, I know it's painful to think about, but that is the industry standard. And it takes them so much time to, check if the connection is working, refresh. Okay, it's not working today. I'll try back again tomorrow. Or in extreme cases, their accountant or bookkeeper is trying to run that for them, and they're hitting up on MFA or multi-factor authentication. Now the small business owner is getting a text at 11 p.m. at night saying someone's trying to log into your account. Do you consent? So that whole flow is so broken, so inefficient. And it's creating a lot of unnecessary friction in the system, right? So that's time back that we can give to small business owners, and ultimately, like open banking will help with that.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, Faye, because it seems like such a hack to get access to the data to really create value for both businesses and consumers. What are some of the biggest risks you see with continuing with that type of an approach, other than the inconveniences? But is there a privacy risk? Is there a risk that this data somehow ends up in the wrong hands?
Yeah, I think yes is the short answer, Jeff. And the irony of the whole thing is, one of the topics that gets brought up a lot within open banking and sort of the need to move slowly and carefully is this idea of security risk, right? And saying, do we have all of the guardrails in place, and do we have the right system and framework to mitigate that security risk? It's one of those things where actually, if you think about the status quo, there's a ton of risk inherent in the system today. The example I'll give you is accountants and bookkeepers that are, in a lot of cases, the most trusted business coach and advisor for a small business owner. They've given them free reign to say, I want you to have access to my bank account. I want you to be able to pull that in, whether it's read-only access or what have you, and pull it into Xero and just tell me what I need to know on a monthly basis. I don't need to be involved in the details. Yeah. I've actually been sent a picture by an accountant to say, here's what I have on my desk today. And it's all of their clients' bank cards and bank numbers with the password for their online banking account right on there. It would make a bank executive cringe because that's a massive security risk, right? The customer has obviously violated the T's and C's on their bank account to provide that, but they're just so sick of having to work around MFA and having to work around all of these broken connections and screen scraping being an imperfect solution. So it's a perfect example in my mind of, we've really tried to address all of the security risks before we move forward at all. And instead we've created a whole new bucket of risk because the show must go on, 100%. Right? Small businesses need to operate. They trust their accountant or bookkeeper and they need the data. Yeah, it's a funny thing to think about, but it's how things are operating today.
It seems like a ticking time bomb to continue with where we're at. And maybe that's the wrong way to think about it, because it's kind of like everyone on the surface may think playing it safe is safe. You know what I mean? Like, if you just play it safe, we'll kind of prevent anything bad from happening. But then I think you kind of wake up 20 years from now and you look at some of the places that maybe have taken a little bit of risk in smart ways, and they've mitigated those risks, and they've made, plans around them, and they've built put really great teams on those risks, and then they get ahead. The risk pays off, and it pays off. And maybe one risk doesn't pay off, and then you take a step back. But then in kind of pushing the envelope, you kind of see some of these countries that are just getting further and further ahead. And we kind of look at some of these numbers with productivity being on the decline, entrepreneurship being on the decline. And you kind of look at what that's going to end up being in terms of quality of life. And I think about my two sons at home and the life that I want them to have. I want them to grow up in a country that's prosperous. And I feel like that's what we had when we grew up. Like there was so much, I don't know, optimism.
Yeah.
And now it's like, we got to get that back. And, there's a lot of talk about, consumer-driven finance / open banking, like what should we call it? But you don't hear enough about the small business and the benefits to small business. And I think people kind of think about it as, okay, it's either going to benefit a small business or it's going to benefit a consumer. And what they don't realize is that benefits to small business are benefits to consumers in the form of lower prices.
Yes.
And so the more costs that are passed on to businesses in the form of, not using technology, high costs of regulation, the customer always ends up paying. And especially when we're dealing with kind of a cost of living crisis and runaway inflation, I feel like more now more than ever, we actually need to get people thinking about this as something that's good for all of Canada, not just consumers. How do you think we get people to care about this? Like, is it a rebranding thing for open banking? Like, what do you think we should be doing?
Yeah. I mean, I think those of us who have been close to the issue for the last couple of years would say 100% open banking needs a rebrand, right? Because no one understands what it means. It sounds really scary. It sounds like you're giving, open access to your password and your bank account, which of course it isn't. I think consumer-driven finance is closer, but what we have really chosen to do is try in our discussions with regulators and the ecosystem to say, let's focus on use cases. And let's also focus on benefits that we've seen from other markets. Because everything that you said earlier, hey, we've got to move slowly, we've got to move carefully. I would maybe agree with that if Canada was going first. But we're decidedly almost now going last within our OECD counterparts. And so they're really good frameworks and lessons that we can take from the likes of the UK and Brazil and to just apply, that here in Canada without having to completely reinvent the model, right? So there's a lot of goodness that we can learn from the other markets and then adapt it to what we need in the market here today. So I absolutely think it needs a rebrand. But what we've chosen to focus on is, if open banking were here, consumer-driven finance were here, what would that mean in terms of the day-to-day for a small business owner, right? How much easier would it be for them to access their bank information, to be able to reconcile their books, to share their data and their financial position with folks of their choosing at any time, to be able to drive lending outcomes, access to capital, right? Additional unlocks or reporting obligations, depending on the type of business that they are, right? So there's so much goodness that can happen. Again, put it in the hands of the small business owner, but ultimately let's make it less painful for them to tap into the resources that are available to them across Canada, right? And you talked a little bit about, hey, it seems like it's getting harder and harder to start a business and successfully run a business in Canada. I think there's just been no shortage of recent information to suggest that's true, right? Even at the start of this month, the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy said 4,800 businesses filed for insolvency in 2023, and that's up over 40% year on year. I talk to our small business customers as often as I can, and what I'm sensing recently is, hey, there's a lot of, for those that took SEBA loans through COVID, there's a lot of angst around needing to repay that, right? And then they're not seeing that pop back, again, as supported by the XSBI data around sales starting to return, right? So like they're getting crunched and pinched on all sides right now. And I think, it's been really hard as a small business owner to stay positive through that.
Well, that was going to be my next question is, what are some of the things that are actually giving you optimism about small businesses in Canada?
Yeah, I think I continue to be just so impressed by the resilience and the creativity that we see from small businesses across the country. And certainly in our conversations with them, just this is a tough time, but we are trying new things. We're adopting new technology, and we're looking at things like digitizing payment options. So I think there's more and more openness to discussing those things and to being open to adopting them, which ultimately we know from our data will actually help them drive better business outcomes. So that gives me a little bit of hope, for sure. I'm probably more on the pessimistic side, to be honest, based on all the data that I just shared with you, Jeff. But I think the resilience is absolutely there, and the realization and the recognition that they've got to be creative, agile, and leveraging the resources around them, certainly. The other thing that gives me hope is, we see in Canada over half of the Canadian small businesses are connected to an accountant or a bookkeeper. And that's one of our core beliefs here at Xero is, the technology is really great, but in the hands of a seasoned professional who's done this across many small businesses, it's even more powerful, right? And so the propensity for small businesses to pick up that advisor, to lean into them and make sure that they're, getting the relevant benchmarks, that they're really leveraging the full power of tools like Xero, that they have visibility to the grants and support programs that are available to them. I think that is something that we get pretty excited about, right? Because we see, again, the power of that accountant or that bookkeeper, that financial advisor to really help be the business coach for small businesses, versus them always feeling like they have to DIY the whole thing.
I heard you mention earlier that you guys are using AI and machine learning, and it wouldn't be a podcast in 2024 without talking about AI. So I have to. And I'm always trying to, we just had Mike from Ada on last week, and I was like really worried that, because I'm always on the lookout for like fake AI companies, because like you and I both know that like everyone's an AI company now, and it's like everyone's a tech company.
It gets you the higher multiple.
Then you get different treatment by investors, but I mean the reality is like there are some legitimate companies that are legitimate AI companies, and Ada I think was very early in AI. How are you? I mean, you guys started out as cloud accounting, so I'm not gonna. By the way, like I believe your competitors, I think is it QuickBooks claims to be an AI company as well.
Correct.
So, I don't think either one of you are. But how are you using AI? And I think how is this going to impact actual business owners?
We've actually had AI in the product in some form or shape since 2018. And so if you think about accounting and that whole process of reconciling your books, just connecting a transaction to office supplies or transaction to, food or travel and expenses, like it's highly repetitive in a lot of cases, right? And so that is a perfect use case to say, how do we leverage intelligently code some of those things and again, save folks time, right? So that's been embedded within Xero for a number of years now. We've also recently started to leverage Gen AI for things like our Xero Central and Support Center. So support in Xero, and actually 90+% of our support inquiries get handled by Xero Central automatically. We've partnered with our partner Coveo, who's actually based in Montreal, to embed Gen AI into folks that are using Xero Central to more intelligently surface the right answer. There's so much content in there. We're now actually piloting using Gen AI to help them find the answer faster, right? So accounting's really interesting because there's a lot of repetitive tasks, but it's also pretty binary in terms of like, you can't really leverage Gen AI because you really need to get it right. So we're moving carefully here, but we're always looking for ways to leverage that, knowing the vast amount of data that we have and our ability to, again, just save folks time by intelligently surfacing or automatically doing things for them.
We talked about this the other day, and it was what leads to the demise of an SMB. And it's often not like a large company killer event. It can kind of be these smaller tasks that build up. And what's exciting to me about what Xero's doing and even the promise of AI is to take some of the lower level tasks and remove them so that people can start thinking about the things that actually may kill the company.
Yes.
Like, lawsuits or, big mistakes that could be made if you're just bogged down with the daily tasks. Do you, from your own experience, like, has that kind of played out to be true, or is it like, what do you think is leading to some of these companies? I think you said over 4,000 last year declared bankruptcy. Is it? Do you get any reporting on kind of the why that is, or in your kind of your feedback you're getting from SMBs? What is it?
Yeah, I don't have any reporting on like that 4,000 number and how it breaks out, but certainly what we hear from both SMBs and then the accountants and bookkeepers that support them is at any given moment, a small business owner is doing the math on, is it worth it, right? What am I bringing in? Like, what's the fulfillment that I get from delivering the product, service, good that I'm delivering? And then, what is my spend and is it worth it, right? And so we talked a little bit about this, like that mindset of just multiple years of challenge and grinding and having a pivoting through COVID and then this new normal and the recovery from COVID and then not so much of recovery from COVID. If you think back to last summer, there was so much optimism around, hey, we're starting to see some of those macroeconomic indicators turn and we think that we might be, on the up and up again. And again, from the XSBI data, it showed like not really 6 consecutive months, right? Continued decline year on year. And so I think just the exhaustion around that is one of the things people just throw in the towel and say, it's not worth it. In fact, I think I'm just going to go back to my corporate gig, right? There was this huge explosion at the start of COVID as we went to remote work and people just trying to make their side hustle their main hustle. And the sense I'm getting is some of those folks have tried that and they've just realized either not for me, harder than I thought. And, I'm just going to go back to maybe a more stable sort of job. But the other key thing really is people run on cash, right? And that's why we are so passionate about cash flow at Xero and leveraging the tools and our ecosystem to help manage that. Ultimately, they just run out of cash. And then they've got to make a tough decision around, is this something I still want to keep going? So anything that we can do as an ecosystem from Neo and financial services to accounting platforms and advisors to help small businesses stay on top of their cash flow and predictively looking forward to say, where are you going to be in 6 months, 9 months, 12 months? I mean, that's just going to help improve financial outcomes and survival rates for small businesses.
Yeah, and I think on the banking side, if we can enable small businesses to force banks to compete properly for their business.
Yeah.
Because I feel like today, and it's on the consumer side too, but everyone knows what it's like. You have something that shows up in your bank statement or something happens with your account and you have to call in, takes an hour. You talk to someone, they can't help you. They don't know who can.
Yeah.
And it's not their fault. It's just that's the system. That's just the way it is. And then you're so angry.
Yeah.
And you want to take your business somewhere else, but then you're like, oh, it's so painful because then I got to move all my money, switch all my bills, move my direct deposit. It's like a heart transplant, basically. And with SMBs, that's probably 10 times worse.
Yep.
They've got so many more payments. You've got integrations.
Yeah.
But what to me it feels like is you're just captured by these institutions, and it's not. I never think that it's anything to do with the people who work there. They're always nice people. But the institutions just haven't. There's just been such a lack of competition.
Yeah.
That I think has just allowed the kind of festering and degradation of these organizations to the detriment of their end customers, whether that be business or consumer, to the point where they can't really go anywhere else very easily because you're like, okay, do I want to spend, if you're a business owner and you're like, do I want to spend a full day at minimum away from my business, switching over to a new company that is going to be just as bad as the one I just came from? It'll just be a different color. Instead of blue, it'll be green.
Yeah.
So, what I'm excited about is working with companies like you guys that are pushing the envelope, that are kind of like banging up against the status quo, wanting to make things different. And I feel like we've got an ally in Xero. And I think there's many other companies as well that want things to be different. They want things to be better, and they know the path to getting there is going to be a little bit different than the path that got us to where we are now.
I couldn't agree more with what you said. And I think ultimately there's, when you think about regulatory programs like open banking, payments modernization, like to your point earlier, there's a hidden cost of inaction, right? And it's this Canadian consumers and small businesses continue to bear the cost of higher transaction fees, lower options, tougher switching costs, right? And the burden on that front. So there's just so much that we are inadvertently paying for as Canadian consumers today that we're really passionate about trying to tackle that. And ultimately, we think Canadian small businesses deserve better.
Company culture-wise, so Xero being a Kiwi company, it's Kiwi, right? New Zealand.
Yeah, we're ASX listed, but founded in New Zealand. So we're listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. Yeah,
that's a bit of a split personality. So I feel like if I think of a company based out of New Zealand's culture, I don't know, for some reason I think of like merino wool type warmth, and I feel like it's just so happy-go-lucky. But are you guys secretly sharks? Like, is it like when I think about, you came from Uber, which notoriously hardcore bro culture. Yeah. Then you go to Xero. Am I getting this right? Tell me what it's been like for you.
Yeah. Well, generalizations aside, no, it's I appreciate that. And I will say, like, any Kiwis that I've met or had the privilege of working with during my time at Xero have been universally incredible and so kind and so nice. But the culture at Xero, and certainly within our New Zealand sort of heritage, is very much, like I said, one of humanity and empathy, compassion, and really caring for our customers, right? Like, since the beginning of Xero's inception, one of the key go-to-market motions and approaches was we're going to work through and with accountants and bookkeepers, because they really hold the keys on the relationship with small businesses. They're the trusted advisors. And so this is a channel and a customer that we really want to nurture. And that has remained true 17 plus years later. So one of the things that was true when we first launched in New Zealand, as we scaled to Australia, as we launched in the UK and the US, and now Canada, is really heroing and valuing the partnership that we have with accountants and bookkeepers, and try to make them the heroes for small businesses. So that gives you an indication of sort of how we work, not trying to cut them out or go around them, is actually saying, hey, we really want to work in partnership with you and building a product that makes sense for them, and really listening to their feedback as we think about product delivery and innovation for what that segment and customer really needs. And so one of the things that I hear a lot is, Faye, like, we love your team, right? We love working with them. They show up for us. They're so, passionate, and they want to work with us. And that's not, common or universal, unfortunately, these days. And so I'm really proud of that fact. And that's, again, gives you a sense of how our culture shows up on the outside. But it's something that is, how we treat one another internally as well. So that human value is really key.
If you could go back in time and give the high school version of Faye any advice, what would you tell her?
I actually had this conversation with some close friends recently, and the advice I would give her is to worry less about school. And my Chinese parents are so upset right now if they won't listen to this, but like, to worry less about school and worry less about grades. I grew up with a group of friends and in a cohort where it was like, you needed to get into the best school, and everyone was freaking out. And I would say worry less about that. Study probably a little bit less, and through high school and through university, like, enjoy the clubs and the extracurriculars and focus on building relationships. That's what you're going to remember from school. It's not the tests or the classes.
I feel like you, just based on this conversation alone, I feel like you did pretty well in school.
Yeah, but I did okay. But even then I would say, hey, I probably need to work less on the grades and more on just being in the moment, experiencing it, and again, building the relationships.
That's solid advice.
Yeah.
Where can people learn more about Xero?
Yeah, for sure. So you can check out our website, xero.com, and that'll give you a bunch of information around our products, etc. Feel free to, if you're listening, hit me up on LinkedIn. Always happy to connect you with folks on the team if you want to talk about partnerships, if you're an accountant or bookkeeper, if you're a small business interested. My DMs are always open to talk more about the product.
Well, I'm a huge fan. We're all huge fans of what you guys are doing. We're cheering you on. I'm super grateful that you took the time to come on, Faye. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for having me. And thanks for letting me relive our old food delivery wars days. That was fun.
Thank you for tuning in to Behind the Brand. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe and leave a review on your preferred podcast platform. If you're interested in learning more about Neo Financial, visit us at neofinancial.com. Behind the Brand is production of Neo Financial and Media Lab YYC, hosted by me, Jeff Adamson. Strategy, research, and production by Philip Burns, Dario Betcher, and Kyle Marshall.